Hello, everyone, and welcome back. And if you are anything like me, someone who carries a whole galaxy of why questions in your head, then tonight, settle in. Because we are stepping into a world that feels familiar and yet strangely distant. A world many of our grandparents survived without realizing they were basically stunt performers. Tonight, we are exploring why American schools of the 1,930 seconds were not just rough around the edges. They were some of the most unintentionally dangerous places you could spend your childhood. Imagine a place meant for learning, yet every corner holds a new risk you never saw coming. A place built to educate, but accidentally designed like an obstacle course, where the main lesson was not math or reading, it was survival. That is, the 1,930 seconds American school system, a strange mix of good intentions, harsh realities, and conditions so unpredictable that students walked into class each morning not entirely sure whether they would leave with new knowledge or new bruises. To understand the chaos, you first have to picture the era itself. The country was deep in the Great Depression, and schools reflected that reality at every level. Budgets were tight, buildings were outdated, and safety standards were more of an optimistic suggestion than a rule. These were not the warm, sanitized classrooms we know today. They were wooden boxes of unpredictable temperatures, freezing in winter, sweltering in summer, with floors polished so heavily they could double as skating rinks, and ceilings that shed flecks of plaster like confetti over spelling tests. Every morning, a child stepped inside, knowing the building itself was part of the challenge. Doors creaked so loudly you could hear them from the other end of the hallway. Window frames rattled during even the gentlest breeze, letting in cold drafts that turned classrooms into miniature wind tunnels. If you were lucky, your desk did not wobble every time you breathed. If you were not, the entire left side of it might collapse during a spelling quiz. The desks were old, heavy, and full of sharp edges, where decades of use had carved grooves deep enough to store secrets. And ergonomic seating simply did not exist. Your seat was a plank of wood, polished not for comfort, but by years of restless students shifting around, trying to keep their legs from going numb. Chalk dust hung in the air like a permanent fog, settling on clothes, hair, books, and sometimes lunch. Schools did not have air purifiers or ventilation systems, just cracked windows that barely opened. Even breathing felt like part of the curriculum. The smell of old varnish, soap, damp wool coats, and something faintly metallic blended into an aroma you never forget once you have lived in it. But the real adventure was not just in the building, it was in the daily rhythm that surrounded it. Teachers had limited resources, so discipline relied heavily on tools like wooden pointer sticks, ruler taps, and stern voices that could silence a room in under 3 seconds. The hierarchy was simple and absolute. Adults had authority, and students followed rules, with a seriousness that came not from respect alone, but from the immediate consequences that followed if they did not. Children learned early that whispering during class was not just frowned. Upon it was an invitation for a sharp rap on the desk that echoed like a miniature thunderclap. And yet, despite all these rough edges, students found ways to adapt. They learned which desks were least likely to pinch their fingers. They memorized where the floor was most slippery. They learned to keep their feet tucked in, so passing classmates would not accidentally kick them during roll call. They learned to sit upright, not only because teachers expected it, but because leaning back too far meant risking a splinter in a place no splinter should ever be. Lighting was another unpredictable guest in the classroom. Most rooms relied on tall, drafty windows and a single dangling bulb that flickered often enough to make you wonder if it was signaling something On cold mornings, sunlight barely crept through frosted glass. On bright afternoons, light spilled across dusty floors, highlighting chalk particles drifting like snow. No one thought twice about it then, but the air quality alone today would shut down a modern school in minutes. Even the daily supplies were miniature hazards. Pencil sharpeners mounted on the wall, turned with the resistance of a medieval torture device. The blade inside looked like it had seen battles. You inserted your pencil, cranked the lever, and prayed it sharpened the lead instead of snapping it in half. Inkwells sat inside every desk, half filled with blue or black liquid that never seemed to behave. One wrong elbow movement could turn the entire front row's homework into an accidental art project. But what truly made 1,932 schools feel like a universe of controlled chaos was not just the objects, it was the unpredictability woven into every moment. You might start the day practicing cursive handwriting, only to be interrupted by the sound of something clattering in the hallway. Or the radiator might suddenly hiss, rattle, and belch out steam like an irritated dragon. Or the roof might creak ominously during a heavy storm, giving you the sense that the entire building was taking a deep breath. Yet, for all the risks, children did not walk around terrified. They were used to it. This was their normal. Older students passed down survival advice, like folklore. Which desk had a loose bolt? Which floorboard made a loud creak and could get you caught sneaking? Which teacher tapped the pointer stick twice before scolding someone? They learned the rhythm of danger so well that navigating it became second nature. And strangely, this environment built resilience. Students learned adaptability not because someone taught them, but because life inside those schools required it. They developed a sense of humor, a thick layer of patience, and a shared understanding that every day was partly an academic lesson and partly a series of small physical tests. No one called it building character back then, but looking back, it certainly did. When we compare this to modern schools with their insulated walls, smooth desks, cushioned chairs, clean floors, climate control, filtered water, and clear safety regulations, you begin to realize just how different things once were. Today, if a ceiling tile falls, the school closes for inspection. In the 1,930 seconds, if plaster flaked onto your notebook, you brushed it off and kept writing. What makes all this even more remarkable is that the children who grew up in these environments went on to live full lives, raise families, build careers, and tell these stories with the kind of nostalgia that softens the roughest memories. They did not see themselves as survivors of danger. They saw themselves as part of a generation that handled whatever came their way. Tonight, as we begin the full journey into the world of 1,930 seconds, American schools, remember this: the classrooms of that era were not polished or gentle. They were not perfect or predictable, but they were alive with noise, with energy, with risk, with resilience. And in their own strange way, they shaped a generation prepared for a world that demanded toughness. So settle in, get comfortable, and let us step deeper into the story, into an era where every school day was an adventure, every hallway a test, and every student a quiet hero of their own survival story. If the buildings themselves made school feel like a daily challenge, then the discipline system of the 1,930 seconds added a whole new layer of tension to the experience. Because in that era, authority was not something you questioned. It was something you felt, sometimes quite literally. Tonight, as we move deeper into our journey, let us explore what it meant to grow up in classrooms where teachers carried more than textbooks. They carried the weight of discipline, tradition, and wooden tools designed to keep order in rooms full of restless young minds. Discipline in the 1,930 seconds was not soft, spoken, or subtle. It did not come in the form of gentle reminders or quiet conversations in the hallway. Instead, it came through routines, structures, and a set of expectations that every child understood without needing them written on the board. A classroom ran on order, strict, unmistakable order, and the teacher was the center of that universe. Imagine stepping inside a classroom where the teacher did not need to raise their voice to quiet the room. All it took was the sound of a pointer tapping the side of the desk, or the sharp clack of a wooden ruler connecting with the tabletop. That sound traveled through the air like a warning bell. Conversations ended mid-sentence, shuffles froze, and even the kid who never stopped fidgeting found perfect stillness. Teachers held their authority with a kind of unshakable confidence. Many of them had taught for decades, surviving generations of mischievous children and doing it with a firmness that became part of the school's identity. They wore the same predictable shoes, moved with the same steady pace, and wielded their pointer stick like a conductor's baton, directing, correcting, and maintaining a kind of controlled harmony. But this authority was not rooted in fear alone. It was rooted in the belief that structure built better people. In an era shaped by economic hardship, uncertainty, and limited opportunity, parents often expected schools to teach more than academics. They wanted schools to teach discipline, self-control, respect, and the ability to endure discomfort without complaint. And teachers took that mission to heart. Children stood when reciting answers. They kept their feet flat on the ground, hands visible on the desk, back straight no matter how uncomfortable the wooden chairs were. Whispering was discouraged. Passing notes was considered a serious offense. Even slouching was enough to earn a pointed glance from the teacher. A 1,930 seconds classroom was more like a tiny theater of manners, where every student played their part and every movement was observed. And then there were the tools of discipline themselves, objects so iconic that people still talk about them today. The wooden pointer, long and smooth, tapped rhythmically on the blackboard as sentences were explained. The yardstick, used to gesture, underline, and emphasize. The ruler, usually tucked neatly under a stack of books, but always close at hand. These items were not symbols of punishment as much as they were symbols of expectation. Their presence shaped behavior before the teacher even said a word. For students, the rules were clear. Follow the rhythm of the classroom, respect the adults in charge, and keep your attention sharp. And while the standards were strict, there was also something strangely predictable about them. A child might worry about missing a math problem or stumbling through a reading exercise, but they never had to wonder what the rules were. Structure was consistent. Expectations were constant. And in a decade when life outside the school was unstable, when families struggled with finances, moved often for work, and sometimes faced shortages of basic needs, this consistency mattered. The classroom, for all its strictness, became a place where order existed, where adults seemed steady, and where the chaos of the outside world could not quite reach. Students adapted quickly. They developed the unique ability to sense a teacher's mood before a word was spoken. They learned the difference between a firm look and a forgiving one. They picked up subtle cues, the way a ruler was placed on the table, the way a pointer clicked against a book to predict whether the day would be calm or demanding. Interestingly, despite the tension these systems created, many former students look back not with resentment, but with a sense of tough humor. They remembered the teachers who spoke, little but communicated everything with a single raised eyebrow. They remember the long lines of students practicing handwriting, while the teacher walked the aisles correcting posture. They remember the moments when the entire class held its breath, because someone in the back row whispered too loudly. And somehow, through the shared tension, a sense of unity was built. Discipline, in the 1,930 seconds, was not just about rules. It was about shaping young people to handle a world that demanded resilience. And while modern classrooms emphasize gentleness, accommodation, and emotional comfort, the classrooms of that earlier era emphasized focus, composure, and the strength to sit through discomfort without losing your place in the lesson. In the end, this strict structure became part of the story of the 1,932nd school experience. It was woven into every memory: the crisp sound of a ruler, the clipped tone of a teacher restoring order, the synchronized stillness that fell over the room when expectations were clear. For better or worse, discipline shaped the way students learned, interacted, and ultimately grew into the adults they would become. If discipline set the tone of the 1,932nd classroom, then the physical environment inside those rooms shaped everything else: the comfort, the mood, the energy, and even the way children learned to cope with the world. And honestly, comfort might be the wrong word entirely, because classrooms of that era seemed designed less for learning and more for testing the limits of human patience. Picture a classroom where the air itself felt heavy. Chalk dust floated like a second atmosphere, settling on shelves, on clothes, on the tiny groove at the top of each wooden desk where pencils rolled back and forth. Every time the teacher clapped the chalkboard erasers outside the window, little clouds drifted back into the room, as if to remind everyone that dust was simply part of their lives. The lighting was not much better. Electricity was available, but it was not always reliable. Many classrooms had a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, glowing with a faint golden tone that flickered whenever someone in the next room plugged in a radio. On bright days, sunlight streamed through tall brand, drafty windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air. On gloomy days, the room felt dim, leaving students squinting at faded ink in old textbooks whose pages had softened from years of turning. And then we get to the temperature, something modern students rarely think about because their classrooms are climate-controlled. In the 1,930 seconds, temperature control was more of an idea than a reality. Winters turned classrooms into tiny ice boxes. Students wore coats indoors, breathed out little puffs of cloudy air, and rubbed their hands together to banish the chill before attempting long division problems. The radiators, when they worked, made odd hissing and clanking sounds that kids learned to ignore. Summers where the opposite rooms became ovens. Windows were propped open with books or rulers, hoping for the smallest thread of breeze. Students fanned themselves with worksheets, while the teacher dabbed their forehead with a handkerchief. Even the chalk felt warm to the touch. And let us talk about those desks. They deserve their own chapter in this story. Built from heavy, dark wood, they looked like they belonged in an old ship rather than a classroom. The seats were attached directly to the desk behind them, forming long rows that forced every child into the same rigid posture. The wood was polished by decades of students shifting uncomfortably, and it creaked under even the smallest movement. If a student leaned too far to one side, the desk might tip just enough to send a ripple of wobbling down the entire row, like a wooden wave of near disaster. Every desk had an inkwell carved into its surface, a little circular opening that seemed harmless until someone accidentally tipped it over during a history lesson. Ink spread fast on those wooden surfaces, soaking into books, and blurring handwriting into abstract, unintentional art. One spilled inkwell could change the energy of the entire day. Air quality was another quiet challenge. Without proper ventilation, classrooms smelled like a mixture of chalk, wet wool, old paper, varnish, and the faint metallic scent of radiator water. For children, this was not unpleasant. It was simply school smell, a scent so distinct that adults decades later could recognize it instantly. Then there were the sounds. Modern classrooms hum with quiet machines, computers, heaters, projectors. But 1,930 seconds. Classrooms were symphonies of wood and metal. The sharp scratch of chalk, the thud of a heavy book closing, the tapping of a teacher's shoes walking between rows, the squeak of a wooden floorboard that somehow always betrayed the steps of anyone trying to move quietly. And even with all these challenges, children did not just survive. They adapted with a kind of resilience that feels almost unimaginable now. They learned to wrap their hands around warm radiator pipes on freezing days. They learned to place a folded cloth or sweater between themselves and the seat to soften the hardwood. They learned to watch the flickering lights and guess whether a storm was coming. They knew exactly which windows let in a breeze and which leaked cold air, even when closed. These small acts became part of the rhythm of school life. A student did not just take their seat, they entered into a silent negotiation with the desk, the room, and the day's weather. No matter how uncomfortable or unpredictable the classroom felt, learning continued. Students leaned forward, listened closely, and somehow absorbed lessons through the haze of chalk dust and creaking wood. And what is amazing is how many adults look back at these memories with warmth. The discomfort does not overshadow the camaraderie. The shared shivers on cold mornings, the laughter when a desk leg squeaked loudly, the collective sigh when a breeze finally entered on a hot afternoon. Those sensory details, uncomfortable as they were, became part of the story of growing up. In its own strange way, the imperfect environment of the 1,930 seconds classroom taught students more than academics. It taught them patience, adaptability, focus in the middle of distraction, appreciation for the smallest comforts. And maybe that is why those memories linger, not because they were perfect, but because they were real, textured, and alive, with the echoes of a time when learning required more than attention. It required endurance. If the classroom environment tested a student's patience, then the daily health conditions inside those schools challenged their resilience in an entirely different way. Because in the 1,930 seconds, staying healthy was not something a school actively protected. It was more like a quiet hope whispered into the air between coughing fits. Illness moved through classrooms the way wind moves through wheat fields, fast, unpredictable, and almost impossible to stop. To understand what it felt like, imagine starting your morning already knowing at least 5 people would be missing from class. Empty desks were not unusual. They were part of the scenery. A child might show up on Monday, pale but determined, then disappear for the rest of the week with no explanation except a note from home saying they were resting. There were no digital check-ins, no temperature screenings, no nurse's office equipped with bright lights and organized shelves. In fact, the school nurse was usually someone's mother from the neighborhood, volunteering a few hours a week because she had a little first aid knowledge and a gentle voice. Her toolkit was not a modern medical cabinet. It was a small wooden box that held cotton pads, a bottle of antiseptic, a few bandages, and vague optimism. If you felt dizzy, she would offer water. If you scraped your knee, she dabbed iodine that stung so sharply you forgot you were hurt. If you were coughing nonstop, she would pat your shoulder with sympathy and encourage you to step outside for fresh air. Hygiene was not a school priority in the way we understand it today. Hand sanitizer did not exist. Soap sometimes ran out. Children shared pencils, books, erasers, rulers, anything within reach. If someone sneezed, the spray traveled freely from row to row, settling onto desks that had not been wiped down in days. Even the blackboard erasers, when clapped together outside the window, sent clouds of chalk drifting back into the classroom, mixing with the breath of 30 students. Winter made everything worse. Windows stayed shut to keep out the chill, trapping every cough and sniffle inside. Students sat bundled in wool coats that were still damp from the walk to school, and the smell of wet fabric mingled with the warm radiator steam. A chorus of coughs became the background music of the season. Teachers did not stop lessons for it. They spoke louder. And yet, through all this, life inside the classroom moved forward. Students grew used to the routine. The classmate who always sneezed 3 times in a row, the one who brought a scarf and never took it off, the one who insisted they were fine even as their voice cracked. There was no stigma around getting sick, not because people were more understanding, but because everyone was always a little unwell. Even lunch breaks did not offer much relief. The cafeteria, if the school had one, was crowded and echoing. Kids sat shoulder to shoulder at long tables, trading bites of sandwiches and drinks without hesitation. Milk arrived in glass bottles that may or may not have been cooled properly. Bread was shared. Spoons were borrowed. Germs traveled freely, hopping between children like invisible hitchhikers. But surprisingly, all this did not dampen the spirit of childhood. Instead, it created a strange sense of collective endurance. Students learned to help each other passing tissues, offering a spare scarf, checking on someone who looked pale. The EBNTs come 1x7C. They built little systems of care long before adults tried to teach them about kindness or community. And through it all, the teachers persisted too. They saw the fatigue in their students' faces, the red noses, the teary eyes from the cold. They noticed when a row looked unusually empty. Some brought warm tea from home. Others let children rest their heads for a few minutes between lessons. They were not health experts. They were guides, trying their best to lead classrooms through seasons that felt longer and heavier than they should. Health, in the 1,930 seconds, was not about prevention. It was about coping. Children were not shielded from discomfort. They adjusted to it. They built a tolerance for little aches and sniffles, understood that some days their bodies felt heavy and other days lighter. And while it sounds challenging now, many adults from that era remember this resilience with a quiet kind of pride. Looking back, it becomes clear that these imperfect conditions, crowded rooms, shared supplies, unpredictable illnesses, were part of the broader world they lived in. Families often dealt with similar challenges at home. Neighborhoods faced them together. The school was not an exception. It was a mirror of the times. And maybe that is why these memories still linger. Not because the conditions were ideal, but because they shaped a generation that learned to keep moving, keep learning, and keep showing up, even when the air felt heavy and their heads felt warm. It was not easy, but it was life. And from that life grew stories that still echo today. Stories of quiet toughness, of shared struggles, and of children who turned even the simplest school day into an act of perseverance. If the daily health struggles painted one layer of the 1,930 seconds school experience, Then the school cafeteria added another one that students remember, with a mix of humor, confusion, and the kind of resilience only childhood can build. Because lunchtime, in theory, was supposed to be a comforting pause in the day. But in the 1,930 seconds, it was a moment of unpredictable surprises, questionable aromas, and meals that seemed determined to test a child's courage as much as their appetite. Walking into a 1,930 seconds cafeteria felt like stepping into a world of muted chaos. The room hummed, with voices bouncing off the high ceilings, metal trays clinking together, chairs scraping the floor, and the constant shuffle of children trying to find seats in long wooden benches that forced everyone to sit shoulder to shoulder. There were no individualized lunches with neatly packed snacks. There were no fruit cups sealed in plastic or juice boxes with adorable mascots. Lunch was not branded or curated. It was simply whatever the school could prepare with the resources they had. And resources were limited. Imagine a meal where the main attraction was something everyone whispered about. A slice of mystery loaf that collapsed slightly in the middle like it was unsure of itself. The kind of loaf that made you tilt your head, just a little, before taking a careful bite. The taste was not bad. Exactly. It was just indescribable. A blend of ingredients that had been stretched to feed dozens of hungry students on a tight budget. Beside it might be a scoop of vegetables that had been boiled into oblivion. Carrots so soft they practically sighed when your fork touched them. Green beans that had long given up their color. Potatoes mashed so thoroughly they looked like clouds, but tasted like a memory of a potato rather than the real thing. And then there was the milk of the 1,930 seconds cafeteria deserves its own spotlight. Served in glass bottles, cloudy with condensation, it often sat longer than intended in rooms that were not always cool enough. By the time it reached a student's tray, the temperature could be anywhere from pleasantly chilled to hope for the best. Children learned to sniff the bottle before drinking, a ritual passed down from older classmates who considered it survival wisdom. Still, despite these unpredictable meals, children ate with laughter. They traded bites, dared each other to try the wobbly gelatin squares, brightly colored, but somehow tasting like faint sweetness wrapped in uncertainty. These gelatin desserts shimmered under the cafeteria lights, quivering with every footstep, making them both fascinating and slightly intimidating. For students who brought food from home, their meals were usually simple: a piece of bread, a smear of something sweet, maybe a small piece of fruit if the season allowed. Lunch from home was not fancy. It reflected the same economic challenges that shaped the entire decade. But no one judged. Everyone understood. Childhood hunger made even the simplest meal feel like a treasure. Cafeteria conversations rarely focused on the food itself. Instead, lunch was the time when students shared stories from their neighborhoods, compared the iciness of their morning walks, bragged about how many chapters they would read last night, or laughed about the latest desk that had decided to wobble dramatically during writing class. Lunchtime was messy, loud, imperfect, and somehow comforting in its own way. The cafeteria workers, too, were part of the story. Often older women from the community, they carried huge pots, stirred giant ladles, and moved with a steady efficiency that kept hundreds of students fed each day. They were not professional chefs. They were caretakers who did the best they could with what they had. Some greeted every child with a smile. Others maintained a stoic expression that hid a soft heart. A few had signature recipes students whispered about: a soup that actually tasted like soup, a bread pudding that felt like a warm hug, a stew that made lunchtime feel almost luxurious. What made the 1,930 seconds cafeteria memorable was not the menu, it was the atmosphere. The shared experience. The sense of community built around meals that were sometimes strange, sometimes comforting, always unpredictable. Children did not eat with the expectation of culinary excellence. They ate because their stomachs growled, because sharing food meant sharing friendship, because even the oddest-looking dishes were better when eaten together. And when lunchtime ended, trays clattered into metal bins, benches scraped across the floor, and students rushed back into their classrooms with renewed energy. The cafeteria had served its purpose, not perfectly, not beautifully, but reliably. It filled stomachs just enough to fuel the rest of the day. Looking back now, adults from that era remember the cafeteria with a chuckle. They remember the warm milk, the rubbery gelatin, the steamed vegetables that tasted like determination. But they also remember the conversations, the laughter, the camaraderie, and the way lunchtime felt like a small break from the strict structure of the classroom. In a world defined by hardship, those moments mattered. They were imperfect, but they were real. And maybe that is why, decades later, these cafeteria memories still linger, not because the food was unforgettable, but because the experience was. If the cafeteria challenged a student's courage, then gym class in the 1930 seconds tested their balance, reflexes, and maybe even their luck. Because stepping into the gym was not simply about exercise. It felt like entering an arena where unpredictability lived in every corner. Today's gym classes emphasize safety mats, lightweight balls, and gentle warm-ups. But in the 1930 seconds, physical education felt like part athletic training, part endurance trial, and part comedy routine, depending on the day. The moment you walked into the gym, the first thing you noticed was the floor, polished hardwood that shone beautifully under the light, and turned into a slip and slide with even a hint of moisture. On rainy days, when students came in with damp shoes and coats, the entire gym became a challenge. Children learned quickly to walk slowly, testing each step like explorers crossing a frozen lake. One misjudged movement, and you would slide a few unexpected feet before regaining balance. Then there was equipment. Modern gym gear is soft, carefully manufactured, and designed for safety. But 1930 seconds equipment carried a kind of rugged charm, heavy medicine balls, thick ropes dangling from ceiling beams, wooden balance beams that wobbled even when you stood perfectly still, and climbing ladders that looked like they came from an old ship. Everything was solid, sturdy, and ready to challenge whoever dared to use it. And nothing embodied that spirit more than the dodgeball of the 1930 seconds. These were not the light foam balls children toss around today. These were firm, rubber spheres, with enough weight to make you reconsider your life choices. When they bounced, they produced a sharp, echoing thud that signaled the start of chaos. Teachers often used dodgeball to burn off energy. Kids ran, dodged, leapt, and occasionally collided with each other, creating moments that were equal parts impressive and comedic. But even with the unpredictability, children loved gym class. It was the one place where the strict structure of the classroom softened a little. The teacher laughed more freely, the rules felt more flexible, and children's personalities shined in ways they could not during spelling drills. The shy kid suddenly sprinted with remarkable speed. The quietest student could dodge 3 incoming balls with the agility of a dancer. The class troublemaker became the hero of the relay race. Gym was not just exercise, it was release. On cold winter mornings, running laps around the gym was the quickest way to warm up. Breath fogged in the air as kids moved, and the room filled with the sound of sneakers tapping the shiny floor. On warm days, the gym's open doors brought in breezes that mixed with the scent of polished wood. And even though the equipment looked intimidating, children approached it with remarkable enthusiasm. They climbed ropes with determination, even if they only made it halfway up. They attempted cartwheels on the hard floor, cheering each other on, even when the landing was less than graceful. They balanced on beams, jumped from wooden platforms, and tried to break their own running records. There was a purity to it, movement for the sake of movement, joy for the sake of joy. Teachers, too, played their part with a unique style. Many were also classroom teachers, simply switching roles after lunch. Their gym shoes squeaked loudly, their whistles echoed across the room, and their encouragement came in short, steady bursts. They were not fitness experts, but they understood how to transform restless energy into structured motion. The gym also hosted activities beyond everyday exercise, seasonal games, winter drills, marching practice, and even indoor versions of outdoor sports. Children learned group coordination, team play, and most importantly, how to laugh at themselves after slipping, tripping, or accidentally throwing a ball in the wrong direction. But as energetic as gym class was, it was also a lesson in resilience. The hard floor meant you learned to fall carefully. The heavy balls taught you to watch your surroundings. The climbing equipment built confidence, one rung at a time. Students might leave gym sweaty, tired, and slightly disheveled, but they also left with a sense of accomplishment. One of the quiet beauties of 1,930 seconds gym class was how it balanced chaos with unity. When a student stumbled, others reached out to help. When someone scored a goal or completed a challenging climb, everyone clapped. When a ball rolled across the floor, multiple students sprinted to grab it. Movement was not just physical, it was social. It bonded classmates in ways the classroom could not. Looking back, adults from that era often laugh about gym class memories, not because they were flawless, but because they were so vibrantly imperfect. They remember slipping on polished wood, jumping rope until their legs burned, climbing ropes that felt impossibly high, and running relay races with shoes that were not designed for speed. They remember the thrill, the noise, the friendly chaos. Gym class, like everything else, in 1,930 seconds. Schools was not easy. It was not polished, but it was real, and it filled childhood with stories of motion, laughter, resilience, and triumph inside a world that often demanded toughness. If the gym was the arena of spirited chaos, then the playground was the wild frontier of the 1,930-second school experience, a place where imagination thrived, rules relaxed, and danger blended seamlessly with delight. Today's playgrounds are padded, brightly colored, thoughtfully engineered. But in the 1,930 seconds, stepping outside for recess meant entering a world built with metal, wood, and unspoken courage. The first thing you would notice was the scale. Play structures were not small. They were towering. Metal jungle gyms rose like geometric skeletons, their bars cold in winter, scorching in summer. Children climbed them with fearless enthusiasm, gripping each rung with hands that learned quickly how to ignore temperature and texture. These structures did not wobble. They creaked, groaned, and occasionally sounded like they were negotiating with gravity, but they held. Slides were long sheets of metal, polished smooth by thousands of children before you. On hot days, they heated up like a stovetop, turning every descent into a test of bravery and speed. Kids learned tricks like lifting their legs slightly, or sliding down with a piece of cloth to avoid the relentless warmth. Even so, the thrill of that brief, flying moment outweighed every discomfort. Swings were not soft, molded seats. They were simple wooden planks, suspended by metal chains, that sang with each motion. Children pumped their legs with determination, competing silently to see who could swing the highest. Some leaned so far forward it looked like they were trying to launch themselves into orbit. The ground beneath was never padded, just dirt, grass, or gravel that left marks on your knees and elbows. And yet, children adored these swings. The sensation of rising into the air, catching a breeze, and feeling weightless just for a moment was worth every scrape. The merry-go-round was another icon. A large, spinning disc of metal and wood pushed by enthusiastic students who darted around it like tiny athletes. Once it reached speed, children clung to the bars with white knuckles, hair flying, eyes wide with a mixture of delight and panic. There were no seat belts, no warnings, no limits, just momentum and laughter filling the air. Recess itself carried a special kind of freedom. After long mornings of strict posture and quiet concentration, stepping outside felt like being unshackled. The air, even dusty air, felt fresher. The noises, the shouts, the thumping feet, the clinking chains became a rhythm that pulsed with childhood energy. For a few precious minutes, students could be completely themselves. No chalk dust, no worksheets, no rigid rules. Games formed naturally. Tag, hopscotch, drawn with chalk from the classroom, jump rope routines, accompanied by rhymes, everyone somehow knew by heart. There was a simplicity to it. No elaborate equipment, no organized teams, no scheduled drills. Play unfolded the way stories unfold in a child's imagination, spontaneously, without planning, with room for every personality to shine. But just like everywhere else, in 1,932 schools, the playground carried risks that modern standards would never allow. Tall platforms had no guardrails. Ladders were steep and narrow. The ground was unforgiving. And yet, children adapted. They developed instincts quickly. How to climb safely. How to balance on metal bars that narrowed at the top. How to jump from the last swing rotation without falling outright. They learned the art of falling gracefully, rolling slightly to avoid bigger impacts. They learned to brush off dirt, ignore little scrapes, and get right back up. Recess was not just a break from learning. It was learning about coordination, confidence, and the limits of one's own small body. One of the best parts of the 1,930 playground was the sense of community it built. Students helped each other climb high structures. They formed human ladders. They steadied the swing for younger kids and cheered when someone reached a new height. Even the occasional disagreements melted quickly. There simply was not enough time to argue when recess was so precious. Teachers supervised from a distance, often bundled in coats or fanning themselves, depending on the season. Their role was less about enforcing strict rules and more about ensuring no one did anything too ambitious. But even they understood the value of play. They knew this was where friendships formed, where children discovered their strengths, and where laughter restored their spirits for the rest of the day. Looking back, adults from that era do not just remember the structures, they remember the feelings. The thrill of climbing just one rung higher than yesterday. The rush of running with the wind. The freedom of recess, where the world felt big and conquerable. They remember going home with dirty hands, flushed cheeks, and stories to tell. And perhaps that is what makes the 1,930 seconds playground so nostalgic. It was not polished or safe by modern standards, but it was alive with motion, with excitement, with the kind of unfiltered joy that only childhood can hold. It taught students not just how to play, but how to try, how to trust their instincts, and how to embrace small risks with big hearts. For many, those recess moments remain some of the brightest memories of their school days, a reminder that even in an era marked by hardship, laughter always found its way into the cracks. If the playground was the kingdom of imagination, then the science lab of the 1,930 seconds was its opposite. A room full of unpredictable tools, mysterious smells, and experiments that lived somewhere between education and sheer improvisation. Today's science classrooms are equipped with gloves, goggles, labeled drawers, and polished counters. But back then, a science lab was a place where curiosity thrived, sometimes more than safety. When students stepped into the lab, the first thing they noticed was the smell. A mix of chemicals, old wood, and faint metallic hints from beakers and burners that had lived through countless lessons. Cabinets held dusty jars with faded labels, some handwritten, others smudged from time. Children whispered about what might be inside crystals, powders, something that looks like tiny pebbles, and occasionally something that simply looked suspiciously like glitter from a bygone experiment gone wrong. The countertops were worn down, marked with faint rings from old beakers and stains that told stories no one fully remembered. Some stains were so old, even the teacher nodded at them with a kind of respectful acceptance, proof of experiments, attempted long before the current class was born. And then there were the tools. Glass beakers with slightly uneven rims, metal stands with bolts that needed tightening, droppers that dripped even when you did not squeeze them, and Bunsen burners that crackled to life with an energy that commanded attention. For students, these burners were not just tools, they were little dragons, breathing blue flames, patient until called upon. The teacher would stand at the front, setting up an experiment with the serious focus of someone preparing a magic ritual. Students watched with wide eyes, leaning forward to catch every detail. The steps were clear, but the outcome always carried a hint of mystery. Would the liquid turn blue? Would the powder bubble? Would the flame flicker? Or would something completely unexpected happen, like a puff of smoke, a surprising fizz, or a sudden sizzling sound that made the whole class jump in unison? And when something did fizzle or smoke more dramatically than planned, the reaction was always the same: gasps, laughter, wide-eyed fascination. Even the teacher sometimes paused, blinking at the unexpected reaction, before composing themselves and continuing the lesson as if everything was perfectly normal. For all its unpredictability, the lab was where students felt like real explorers. They held glassware with careful hands, poured liquid slowly, stirred mixtures with wooden sticks, and followed instructions with an attention they rarely summoned in other subjects. The stakes felt higher not because of danger, but because each experiment felt like a chance to witness something magical. But make no mistake, the equipment itself carried challenges. Beakers chipped easily, droppers clogged unexpectedly. Some chemicals were older than the students' parents, stored in jars so delicate that teachers handled them like fragile artifacts. When students needed to clean up, they rinsed everything in deep sinks that sometimes rattled from the force of the water. The faucets hissed loudly, steam rising on colder days, turning the cleanup process into a mini adventure of its own. And sometimes, despite everyone's best intentions, things did not go according to plan. A mixture bubbled over. A paper caught the edge of a flame. A beaker rolled off the table and shattered into glittering pieces. When that happened, the room grew silent for a moment. Then the teacher sighed, reached for a broom, and gave a brief speech about being mindful of your workspace. But even these mishaps were part of the magic. Students whispered about the most dramatic experiments for weeks. Remember when the flame turned green? Remember when the mixture overflowed like a tiny volcano? Remember when the whole room smelled like lemons for an hour? Science class was not just about learning facts. It was about experiencing wonder firsthand. What made 1,930 seconds labs truly special, though, was how they nurtured curiosity. Students were not handed digital simulations or step-by-step worksheets with QR codes. They were handed tools imperfect, worn, but real. They were invited to mix, observe, question, laugh, and sometimes jump in surprise. They were not shielded from unpredictability. They were guided through it. And this guidance, this gentle introduction to the unknown, sparked something in many young minds. Some children discovered a love for building. Others gained a fascination with reactions and transformations. For some, it was the thrill of watching something change right before their eyes. For others, it was simply the joy of doing something hands-on for once. Teachers in the 1,930 seconds understood that science was not just a subject, it was an experience. They may not have had modern tools, but they had enthusiasm, storytelling, and the kind of patience that turned even simple experiments into memorable chapters of childhood. Looking back, adults from that era often recall science class with a mix of fondness and humor. They remember the smell of the lab, the flicker of the burner, the strange powders, the bubbling mixtures, the little surprises that kept them alert, and the feeling that they were part of something exciting, something that transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary. The science lab was not controlled or polished, but it was alive with curiosity, discovery, and the gentle thrill of not knowing exactly what might happen next. If the science lab hinted at hidden risks, then the school buildings themselves quietly carried the greatest surprises of all. To a child in the 1,930 seconds, a school was simply a place where mornings began with chalk and ended with recess. But looking back now, adults remember how these buildings felt alive in their own unpredictable ways, creaking, shifting, and revealing quirks that no one questioned at the time. The moment you approached a 1,930-second school, you could sense its age. Many buildings were constructed decades earlier, with tall brick facades, heavy wooden doors, and long hallways that echoed even the softest footsteps. The floors were hardwood, polished until they shone like mirrors, and every step created a familiar rhythm: tap, creak, tap. Children did not tiptoe. They announced their presence with every stride. Inside the classrooms, walls bore layers of fading paint, often in muted greens, pale yellows, or dusty blues. These were not just colors. They were part of the building's personality, and each layer held its own history. Paint flaked near the windows, peeling in delicate curls that drifted onto the floor. No one found it unusual. In fact, teachers sometimes swept the flakes into small piles before lessons began, just another part of the morning routine. Pipes wrapped in thick white insulation lined the ceilings or hugged the corners of walls. They rattled on cold mornings, hissed when the old boiler worked too hard, and occasionally let out tiny puffs of warmth that students flocked to in winter. To children, these insulated pipes looked like mysterious vines stretching across the building. No one questioned what they were made of. They were simply the pipes, silent guardians of warmth. The ceilings told stories, too. They were high, much higher than modern ones, and made of plaster that sometimes cracked in delicate lightning patterns. During rainy days, those tiny cracks darkened slightly, creating new shapes students traced with their eyes during long arithmetic lessons. A faint fleck of plaster might fall occasionally, landing softly on a notebook or a sleeve. It was never alarming, just a quirk of an old building. But the real heart of the school was its staircases. Wide wooden stairs led to upper floors, their handrails smooth from generations of hands sliding along them. Each step had a distinct sound, a gentle thump at the bottom, a hollow echo in the middle, a muted groan toward the top. Children raced up and down them, the entire structure vibrating slightly under the stampede of small feet. Even teachers seemed to accept this gentle shaking as part of the building's charm. Hallways were long, sometimes dim, with tall windows that welcomed sunlight, but did not always close properly. Winter drafts slipped through the gaps, and students seated near windows learned to keep an extra scarf on hand. When the wind was strong, a faint whistle echoed through the corridors, a natural soundtrack that made the school feel almost alive. Storage closets were their own miniature mysteries. Every classroom had one, a narrow space filled with stacked chairs, dusty erasers, jars of old paint, wooden rulers, and bundles of string. For students, these closets felt secretive. They imagined hidden worlds behind the shelves, convinced there were forgotten treasures tucked deep inside. And sometimes there were a lost marble, a crumpled note, a folder from a class long ago. But perhaps the most memorable feature of 1932nd school buildings was their heating system. Large radiators hugged the walls, clanking and sputtering like miniature steam engines. They warmed rooms unevenly, too hot near the radiator, too cold across the room, creating pockets of temperature that students learned to navigate strategically. Some children sat close to feel the heat seep into their hands. Others avoided the radiator corner entirely, especially when it let out a dramatic hiss that startled even the bravest. Despite all these quirks, children felt deeply connected to their school buildings. They did not see flaws, they saw character. They did not see outdated materials. They saw familiar landmarks. The cracked wall near the third window was not a flaw. It was where Julia sits. The squeaky floorboard near the cubbies was not a problem. It was the spot that always gives us away. The drafty corner was not inconvenient. It was the windy seat. There was a comforting rhythm to it all. Students knew which door stuck during humid days, which light flickered when someone walked too fast, which part of the wall felt warm after lunch. The building was not just a structure, it was a companion, unpredictable but steady, flawed but familiar. Looking back now, adults marvel at the resilience of both the buildings and the children who filled them. Those old halls shaped generations through noisy mornings, quiet afternoons, and winters that stretched endlessly. The imperfections gave the place a soul, and every creak, hiss, and flicker became part of the soundtrack of growing up. To today's eyes, 1,930 seconds. School buildings might seem outdated, even startling. But to those who lived through them, they were chapters of childhood, echoing with laughter, footsteps, whispered secrets, and the unspoken understanding that life was not perfect, but it was full of stories worth remembering. If the school building felt like a charming relic from another era, then the school bus was its unpredictable, rattling cousin, less a vehicle and more an adventure with wheels. For many students, in the 1,930 seconds, The day did not truly begin until the ride to school, a journey equal parts excitement, chaos, and blind faith in whoever was behind the steering wheel. The bus usually appeared at the end of the road in a cloud of dust, its engine coughing like it had run through 3 counties without a break. To children, this sound was a morning anthem, an unmistakable signal that time was running out to grab lunch pails, tie loose shoelaces, and scramble outside. The bus itself was a patchwork of dents, scratches, and hasty repairs, held together by bolts, wire, and whatever the local mechanic had on hand that week. Climbing aboard was the first test of the morning. The metal steps were narrow, slightly uneven from decades of use, and had a way of collecting puddles on rainy days. Children learned quickly to step carefully or risk starting the day with damp socks. The driver greeted everyone with a nod that implied both welcome and warning. These drivers were characters in their own right, stoic, unbothered, and seemingly capable of navigating any road with one hand while sipping from a steaming cup of morning coffee with the other. Inside, the bus was a world unto itself. Long benches ran down either side, their cushions thin and stiff from years of wear. The seats had a springiness that felt thrilling to younger kids and mildly alarming to anyone over the age of 12. Every bump in the road sent a ripple from the front to the back, as if the bus were a giant musical instrument reacting to the rhythm of the day. There were no seat belts, no assigned spots, and no soft landings, only the unspoken rules developed through experience. Sit too close to the front, and you risked becoming an unofficial helper, answering questions about who got on where and keeping an eye on the younger children. Sit too far in the back, and you entered a realm governed by older kids, the realm of secrets, jokes, noisy trading, and occasionally a spontaneous debate over who brought the best lunch. This was the unofficial parliament of the bus, where alliances formed and dissolved as quickly as the changing countryside outside the window. The bus's windows were always foggy in the winter and streaked with dust in the summer. Yet kids treated them like canvases, drawing shapes, messages, and little stories that vanished with the next swipe of a sleeve. On certain days, condensation turned the windows into a shimmering blur, giving the outside world a dreamlike quality. The ride itself was never predictable. Rural roads twisted and curved through farmland, forests, and narrow bridges. Gravel paths rattled the entire bus like a giant tin toy. Potholes were so deep they could lift you an inch off your seat if you were not holding on to something. And whenever the bus turned sharply, children instinctively leaned together, a momentary merging of balance and shared survival instinct. Sometimes, the bumps were so sudden that lunch pails clattered to the floor, books slid down the aisle, and laughter erupted like a spark catching dry tinder. Even on quiet mornings, the rumble of the bus created a comforting background, a steady soundtrack of wheels humming against old roads. The social world inside the bus was just as vivid as any classroom drama. Someone was always forgetting their homework, someone else was showing off a new marble or a ribbon, and there was always one child who proudly claimed they could predict every turn just by the sound of the engine. On particularly memorable days, someone might smuggle a frog or an unusual rock they found near home, turning the back row into an impromptu natural science club. Chaperones rarely rode the bus. It was a world supervised solely by the driver, and even then only partially. Drivers had a gift for focusing entirely on the road while simultaneously knowing exactly who was standing, who was trading cards, and who was plotting to switch seats while the bus slowed. A single raised eyebrow in the mirror could silence the entire back row. But no matter how rowdy or unpredictable the ride became, stepping off the bus always felt triumphant. Children emerged, slightly rumpled, hair wind-tossed, carrying crumbs of laughter and leftover morning excitement into the schoolyard. For many, the bus ride was the warm-up for the day, a place where friendships started, moods shifted, and small stories unfolded. The return ride in the afternoon carried its own energy. Sunlight spilled through the windows, warming the seats and casting long shadows. Everyone was a little tired, a little louder, and a little more eager to get home. The bus felt livelier, filled with retellings of the day's adventures, newly learned secrets, or dramatic reenactments of the dodgeball game during recess. And then there was the simple joy of reaching your stop, stepping onto the dirt path or gravel driveway. The bus pulling away in a cloud of dust, leaving behind a trail of exhaust and the faint echo of children's voices. For all its quirks and chaos, the bus was a loyal companion there in the morning light. There again, when the day ended, always ready to carry its cargo of stories and small adventures. Looking back, adults often smile when they remember those rides. Not because the bus was comfortable or modern, it was not, but because it was a world of shared moments, whispered jokes, and tiny daily quests that stitched childhood together. If the bus taught kids how to balance through chaos, then the classroom rituals of the 1,930 seconds taught them something entirely different: how to stand still in the face of pressure. Whether it was homework checks, handwriting drills, or navigating the unpredictable rules of a substitute teacher, these rituals left a mark, quiet, emotional, and often unforgettable. Every school day began with a predictable ceremony, homework collection. To modern ears, it might sound simple, but in a 1,930 seconds classroom, this moment carried the tension of a small courtroom hearing. The teacher moved down the aisles with slow, deliberate steps, collecting assignments with the solemnity of a judge reviewing evidence. Students sat up straighter as she approached, fingers trembling slightly over their notebooks. You could feel a spark of electricity in the room, the nervous sort, the kind that made even the most confident students second-guess their work. Because here, mistakes were not hidden behind gentle comments or private conversations. If your homework was missing, or smudged, or torn, the whole class would know. The process was simple. If your assignment was not there, you stood up, walked to the front, and explained why. In that long walk, time stretched. It felt as if every eye in the room followed your footsteps, and even the chalk dust paused mid-air to watch. No excuse was quite good enough. My little brother ruined it. I left it by the stove. It fell out of my pail on the bus. Each explanation only deepened the teacher's thoughtful frown. It was not cruelty, just the strict rhythm of the times. Personal responsibility was a lesson taught as seriously as arithmetic. After your confession came the most famous punishment of the era, writing lines. "I will remember my homework." Written dozens of times in looping, tired handwriting until your wrist throbbed and your pencil dulled to a stub. But even this ritual was only the beginning. There was the daily challenge known as penmanship class, a subject now mostly forgotten, but once considered a cornerstone of education. Students were expected to master the Palmer method, a disciplined style of cursive that flowed like calm river water, each loop measured, each stroke precise. To a child, it felt more like a test of endurance. Pens at the time were temperamental things, leaking at the wrong moment, and refusing to glide when you needed them most. Inkwells sat on every desk, some half dry, others too full. And no matter how careful you were, sooner or later, a blue stain would bloom on your fingers, a mark that stayed for days, a badge of battle. The teacher paced behind the rows of desks, correcting posture, adjusting elbows, tapping lightly on the table whenever a letter strayed too far from the line. Relax your wrist. Let the motion come from your shoulder. Make the loop wider, not taller. And through it all, students scribbled, erased, dipped, and tried again. A perfectly formed cue felt like a small victory. A page smudged by accident felt like the end of the world. Textbooks often added a final layer of challenge. Many were decades old, handed down through countless classes. Pages were thin, ink faded, corners bent like soft cloth. Notes in the margins from students long gone, whispered jokes, doodles, or half-hearted math answers. These books were history lessons in themselves, not just in content, but in the ghosts of children who once held them. Then there were the unpredictable days, the days when a substitute teacher appeared at the door. A hush fell instantly over the room. Subs were wild cards, each with their own style of teaching or surviving. Some were gentle souls, trying their best to follow the day's lesson plan. Others leaned heavily on discipline, rattling rulers, or clearing their throats with dramatic flair. And some, bless their hearts, simply tried to keep the room in one piece until the final bell. Students, on the other hand, saw these days as an experiment in boundaries. Could they whisper more? Switch seats. Trade erasers. Sometimes the classroom became a miniature storm of chaos. Whispered jokes, sudden tapping sounds, and unexpected paper airplanes gliding across the room like small messages of rebellion. The substitute always fought valiantly, though results varied. But in the quiet moments, when the room finally settled enough for reading or arithmetic, a substitute often surprised students with stories from their own childhoods, tales that lingered far longer than lessons from the textbook. And then, for the few brave or unlucky, there was the dreaded walk to the principal's office, a ritual of its own. The hallway felt colder, the footsteps louder, and the principal's quiet voice carried more weight than any reprimande. Children learned to respect the rules, not because they were afraid, but because the rhythm of school life made every moment feel part of a larger story. These rituals shaped habits, strengthened resolve, and years later became memories told with laughter instead of anxiety. Looking back, adults often marvel at how much those old rituals taught them. Not just about handwriting or punctuality, but about steadiness, about showing up even when mistakes were made, about trying again when a page tore or ink spilled, about growing one imperfect line at a time. By the time the final bell rang each afternoon, students of the 1,930 seconds had lived through a full day of challenges that stretched far beyond reading or arithmetic. They slipped on polished floors during gym, braved wobbly desks in drafty classrooms, navigated unpredictable bus rides, and endured handwriting drills that demanded the patience of a monk. But somehow, through all the noise, scratches, surprises, and small daily tests, children did not just endure, they grew. This resilience did not arrive all at once. It was stitched into the rhythm of school life, woven from countless small moments that did not feel important at the time, but became unforgettable threads in hindsight. Think of the child who arrived at school with cold hands and returned home with cheeks red from recess, hair tousled from the wind, and a story ready to share. That child learned, without realizing it, how to face discomfort without letting it stop them. Or consider the student who stared at a complicated math problem, tapping their pencil against the desk while sunlight drifted across their workbook. When the answer finally clicked, a small but satisfying triumph, that child learned how persistence can turn confusion into clarity. Every one of these moments seemed ordinary then. They were simply parts of a school day. But taken together, They formed the quiet foundation of a generation that knew how to keep moving forward even when the world felt tough. Because schools in the 1930 seconds were not designed to cushion students from hardship. Instead, they reflected the world outside, practical, imperfect, and always in motion. Buildings creaked like old ships. Playgrounds did not hide their challenges. Buses rattled along bumpy roads. Classrooms demanded attention even when they were cold, or hot, or a little bit noisy. Nothing was ideal, but everything was real. And in this realness, children discovered strengths they did not know they had. They learned to laugh in moments when things went wrong, like when a beaker bubbled over unexpectedly in the science lab, or when the school bus hit a pothole so big it launched them an inch off the seat. They learned to adapt, adjusting to the quirks of old buildings, navigating flickering lights, and figuring out which radiator worked on cold mornings. They learned to cooperate, sharing pencils, steadying swings for younger kids, offering tissues during winter cold outbreaks, or helping a classmate pick up scattered papers in the hallway. They learned resourcefulness, repairing notebooks with bits of string, using scrap paper for practice, or keeping small pebbles in their pockets for counting during math. Most importantly, they learned endurance, the kind that grows slowly and quietly, not through grand heroic acts, but through thousands of tiny moments where giving up simply was not an option. Even the day's challenges became part of the charm. Adults looking back often speak with a mixture of nostalgia and amusement. How the radiators clanked like miniature trains. How chalk dust never quite disappeared from clothes. How the yardstick tapping on a desk could quiet a room instantly. How the cafeteria smelled different every single day, sometimes surprisingly pleasant, sometimes less so. And yet, for all the imperfections, these memories glow. They glow because they were shared by entire classrooms, by entire communities. Everyone lived through the same awkward desks, the same cold hallways, the same slippery floors, and unpredictable bus rides. These shared experiences formed bonds that lasted long after report cards were forgotten. Children did not just survive. School in the 1930 seconds they belonged to it. Every scratch on a desk, every creak in a staircase, every echo in a hallway was part of the landscape of their childhood. The school was not a polished institution. It was a second home. A loud, cold, warm, creaky, sometimes chaotic second home, but a home nonetheless. And through all this, education happened, not just the kind that fits neatly in textbooks, but the deeper lessons that shape the way a person walks through life. Lessons about keeping your balance even when the floor is slippery. Lessons about focusing even when the light flickers. Lessons about understanding others, even when they are loud or restless or having a difficult day. Lessons about patience, cooperation, creativity, and the surprising strength hidden inside each small moment. By the time students stepped back onto the bus, at the end of the day, sometimes tired, sometimes chatty, sometimes silent, they carried with them a quiet pride. Not a pride announced out loud, but the kind you feel in your chest when you have made it through something challenging and come out just a little stronger. Looking back now, it becomes clear that the toughness of that generation was not accidental. It was shaped by cold classrooms, chipped beakers, rattling buses, towering playgrounds, and handwritten pages filled with careful loops. It was shaped by laughter, discomfort, surprise, teamwork, and the daily determination to keep going. Childhood in the 1930 seconds was not easy, but it was full of texture, color, and stories that echo through time, reminding us that even in the most imperfect settings, people can grow in extraordinary ways. And so, as our journey through the 1932nd school day slowly comes to an end, we can finally step back and see the whole picture like wiping chalk dust from a blackboard to reveal a story that was always there, waiting to be remembered. We have walked through drafty hallways and listened to floors that creaked like old wooden ships. We have peeked into science labs where small reactions sparked big wonder. We have sat in cold classrooms, squeezed into wooden desks that wobbled with every breath. We have tasted cafeteria meals that built more courage than cuisine. We have run across playgrounds where metal swings, tall jungle gyms, and scorching slides turned recess into a miniature adventure. We have climbed onto rattling school buses that carried not just children, but entire worlds of whispered jokes, friendships, and tiny morning stories. We have watched teachers guide, correct, encourage, and sometimes surprise us with lessons that stretched far beyond the page. And through it all, we have seen how an imperfect world shaped a remarkably resilient generation, one quiet moment at a time. Maybe that is the hidden beauty of those days. They were not comfortable, but they were real. They were not polished, but they were unforgettable. Every scratch on a desk, every clank of the radiator, every shaky staircase and chalk-smudged sleeve, these were not flaws. They were details, threads, woven into childhood memories that stayed warm even as the world changed around them. And tonight, as we close this story, maybe you can feel a little of that warmth too. A reminder that sometimes the most ordinary moments from the past shine the brightest when we look back. A reminder that strength often grows from small challenges. And a reminder that every generation carries its own quiet wisdom, shaped not by perfection, but by experience. If you enjoyed this gentle walk through time, cảm ơn bạn đã ở đây, lắng nghe và cùng mình khám phá. And if you are like me, someone who always carries 1,000 curious questions in your heart, then do not worry. There are so many more stories waiting for us. So for now, chúc bạn một buổi tối thật nhẹ, thật dễ chịu. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And I will see you again in the next chapter. Good night, everyone. The Stalinst Stellenst in a Stalin one against a starting, in a Stalin startingst, one against a startings.